The title of today's lecture is GDP as a measure of economic well-being. Now, if you remember in previous lectures, we discussed if or why we should measure GDP. And one of the underlying purpose of measuring GDP is to see how well we are doing across countries and also over time. So in this lecture, we'll talk about how effective GDP is in measuring economic well-being. In a way, this lecture is also to offer as a critique of GDP as a measure of well-being, because GDP does include lots of factors that affects our material well-being, but also it misses out on a lot of other things. For example, GDP does not include value of leisure. GDP only includes goods and services that you produce. Now, moment you engage in production, which is also work, which means that you are giving up your leisure time. The time you spend with your family, time which you spend in vacation are not included in the measurement of GDP. GDP also does not include the value of clean environment. Now we all know as the human being progresses economically and materially, we are also hurting the environment. And often the value of clean environment is not accounted for in the GDP. GDP also does not include any production that happens outside the market. For example, the time you spend on taking care of your parents, taking care of your children, or the volunteer work is not part of the GDP. So GDP includes or fails to include a lot of things which we do value in our day-to-day life. Perhaps the best way it was put forward by late Senator Robert Kennedy in 1968, where he puts it, gross domestic product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our courage, nor our wisdom, nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile, and it can tell us everything about America except why we are proud that we are Americans. I think it's very nicely put by late Senator Robert Kennedy. GDP does fail to include a lot of things that we value in our life. Then the question arises, then why do we care about GDP at all? Now, typically what we have found, having a large GDP enables a country to afford better schools, a cleaner environment, and healthcare. No doubt all these things does cost money, and if a country is richer, which typically means that country has higher GDP, it also means that country also has better of all these factors. Also, we found that many indicators of the quality of life are positively correlated with GDP. For example, in rich countries or high GDP per person, we have better life expectancy, we have better literacy, we have better internet usage. On the other hand, countries with lower GDP per person are worse in life expectancy, literacy, and internet usage. Having said that, economists do understand the limitations of GDP as a measure of economic well-being. But for all practical purposes, GDP also include things which are helpful in measuring economic well-being. To get an alternative measure of economic well-being, efforts have been made by the economists and policymakers. And the most well-known alternative measure of GDP is something called Human Development Index, or HDI. It is a composite statistics of life expectancy, education, and per capita income indicators, which are used to rank countries into 4 tiers of human development. A country scores higher HDI when lifespan is higher, the education level is higher, and the GDP per capita is higher. So HDI is a comprehensive measure or it does include GDP as a measure of well-being, but it also includes some direct measures of economic well-being, which is health and education. HDI is published by United Nations Development Program or UNDP, and I'll show you some of the details of this HDI program using their HDI website by going into this link. So this is the UNDP website for Human Development Index. So every year they produce something called Human Development Reports for most of the countries in this world. And you can see HDI was created to emphasize that people and their capabilities should be the ultimate criteria for assessing the development of a country, not economic growth alone. So HDI was developed to counteract the limitations of economic growth or GDP as a measure of well-being. And in this figure, it shows different dimensions. It measures long and healthy life, which is measured through life expectancy. It measures knowledge, which is measured through education, and also it measures decent standard of living, which is measured through GNI, which is gross national income, is similar thing as gross domestic product. So GDP and GNI are very closely related concepts, and so all these three things are combined together to produce Human Development Index. And you can access data on Human Development Index by going to this data site and getting the report. And you can get the individual report by clicking on this report section here, and you can get all sorts of information.